Hannah's skeletal frame trembled violently as the biting chill of the concentration camp cut through her tattered rags like knives. Her once vibrant chestnut locks, now dull and lifeless, hung in matted clumps around her sunken face. Streaks of grime accentuated the deep hollows of her cheeks, her haunted eyes bearing witness to the unspeakable horrors she had endured. The overwhelming stench of death and decay clung to her emaciated body like a suffocating shroud, a constant and sickening reminder of the atrocities unfolding around her. As the rusted doors of the cattle car screeched open with a deafening screech, Hannah squinted against the harsh glare of the sun, her eyes struggling to adjust to the bleak and desolate landscape of Auschwitz. The cacophony of anguished cries and barked orders from the Nazi guards assaulted her senses, sending waves of terror coursing through her frail body. Rough, calloused hands seized her violently, their grip bruising her already battered flesh as they shoved her into the mass of prisoners being herded like cattle towards the looming gates of hell. The stench of human misery hung thick in the air, a putrid cocktail of sweat, urine, and feces that burned Hannah's nostrils and coated the back of her throat with a bitter, acrid taste. The train car had been a nightmarish journey, packed to the brim with starving, terrified souls, their bodies pressed together in a suffocating mass of despair. The floors were slick with bodily fluids, and the air was thick with the stale stench of vomit and diarrhea. As Hannah stumbled out of the train, her bare feet met the frozen ground, the icy chill biting into her soles like shards of glass. She cast a haunted gaze around the bleak landscape, taking in the rows of barbed wire fences and the ominous watchtowers that loomed overhead like silent sentinels. The screams of the damned echoed all around her, a symphony of agony that chilled her very soul. Rough hands shoved her forward, the guards barking orders in guttural tones as they herded the prisoners towards the gates of Auschwitz. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind reeling with the horrific tales she had heard whispered among the prisoners, tales of torture, starvation, and mass execution. As the gates loomed ever closer, she felt a cold dread settle in the pit of her stomach, the realization dawning that she had entered a waking nightmare from which there may be no escape. For weeks, Hannah endured the relentless torment of the Nazi regime, her body and spirit pushed to the very brink of endurance. The beatings were merciless, the guards taking sadistic pleasure in raining down blows with truncheons and rifle butts, their faces twisted into masks of hatred and cruelty. Bones cracked and flesh split as Hannah and her fellow prisoners were beaten into submission, their cries of agony echoing through the camp like the wails of the damned. Starvation was a constant companion, gnawing at their insides with ravenous hunger pangs. The meager rations they received were little more than scraps, barely enough to sustain life. Hannah's ribs protruded obscenely, her skin stretched taut over her skeletal frame, her cheeks sunken and hollow. The taste of hunger was ever present, a bitter reminder of the depravity they were subjected to. And yet, through it all, Hannah clung to the flicker of hope that burned within her soul, a defiant ember that refused to be extinguished. In the darkest moments, when the weight of her suffering threatened to crush her spirit, she found solace in the camaraderie of her fellow prisoners. They shared what little they had, a stolen glance, a whispered prayer, a fleeting touch that reminded them of their humanity. These small acts of kindness and solidarity were like lifelines, tethering them to the world beyond the barbed wire fences. They huddled together, sharing stories of their lives before the nightmare, reminiscing about the warmth of family and the simple joys they had once taken for granted. In these moments, they were more than just prisoners. They were human beings, clinging to the last vestiges of their dignity and hope. Despite the torture, the starvation, and the degradation that had become their daily bread, Hannah and her comrades found strength in their shared suffering. They encouraged one another, offering words of comfort and support when the darkness seemed too overwhelming. Together, they vowed to endure, to survive, and to bear witness to the atrocities they had endured, so that the world might never forget the depths of human cruelty Rumors began to circulate among the prisoners, whispers of a shower room where the unlucky were taken, never to return. Hannah's skepticism grew as she observed the Nazis' callous disregard for human life. Cleanliness seemed an absurd notion in this place of unimaginable cruelty. One moonless night, driven by a desperate need for answers, Hannah slipped away from the barracks, her bare feet leaving imprints in the frost-bitten earth. Guided by the faint glow of a distant light, she crept towards a nondescript building, her heart pounding in her chest. As Hannah peered through the grimy window, the scene that unfolded before her eyes seared into her very soul like a branding iron, searing an indelible mark of horror that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Rows upon rows of naked bodies lay motionless on the cold, unforgiving floor, their faces contorted into silent screams of agony, frozen in the throes of death. The acrid stench of decay hung heavy in the air, a putrid miasma that assaulted her nostrils and threatened to choke her with its intensity. Mingling with the overpowering reek of death were the echoes of anguished cries that seemed to reverberate from the very walls themselves, the ghostly wails of those who had met their end in this chamber of horrors. Hannah could almost feel their torment, their desperate gasps for air as the poisonous gas seeped into their lungs, burning and suffocating them from the inside out. The haunting screams pierced her soul, each one a knife twisting in her gut, as she bore witness to the slow, agonizing deaths of her fellow prisoners. Some clawed at their throats, their eyes bulging in silent pleas for mercy, while others convulsed violently, their bodies racked with spasms as they succumbed to the lethal fumes. Hannah recoiled in horror, her stomach heaving violently as the realization dawned upon her with sickening clarity. The shower room was nothing more than a meticulously designed gas chamber, a cold and calculated instrument of mass murder. She stumbled back, her mind reeling, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the fate that awaited them all. The images seared into her psyche, the screams echoing in her ears like the wails of the damned, as she made her way back to the barracks. Each step was a struggle, her legs threatening to give way beneath the weight of the horror she had witnessed. The barracks offered no solace, no respite from the nightmare that had become her reality, as she huddled in a corner, her body racked with sobs, her soul forever scarred by the atrocities she had seen. Days passed, each one a torturous eternity, until the dreaded summons came. Hannah and her fellow prisoners were herded towards the ominous building, their steps leaden with the weight of their impending doom. As the heavy steel door clanged shut behind them, Hannah's gaze swept over the stark, tiled room. The air was thick with dread, punctuated by the muffled sobs of those who had already accepted their fate. Hannah's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of memories. The warmth of her mother's embrace, the laughter of childhood days long since extinguished, the dreams of a future now cruelly snatched away. Suddenly, the distant staccato of gunfire pierced the oppressive silence, sending ripples of hope through the terrified masses. The Americans were closing in, their advance heralded by the thunderous roar of artillery. But it was too late. The hissing of gas filled the chamber, and Hannah's lungs burned as she gasped for air. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself slipping into the abyss, the screams of her fellow prisoners fading into a distant echo. Time seemed to stand still as Hannah teetered on the precipice of oblivion, her mind clinging to the fleeting fragments of her life. In those final moments, she heard the resounding crash of the chamber door being breached, the muffled shouts of the American soldiers cutting through the haze. As consciousness slowly seeped back into Hannah's battered form, she found herself enveloped in the strong arms of a soldier, his face a blur of concern and disbelief. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus through the haze of pain and disorientation that enveloped her. It was then that the full weight of her surroundings crashed down upon her like a tidal wave of horror. She was lying amidst a sea of lifeless bodies, their pallid faces frozen in masks of agony, their eyes wide and unseeing. The stench of death hung thick in the air, a putrid miasma that threatened to choke her with its intensity. Hannah's gaze swept over the grisly scene, taking in the contorted forms of those who had been her companions in suffering, her friends, her family in this waking nightmare. Some lay twisted and tangled, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, while others were curled in fetal positions, as if seeking solace in the embrace of death. Bile rose in her throat as she recognized the familiar faces, now forever etched with the anguish of their final moments. There was Miriam, her once vibrant eyes now dull and lifeless, her mouth frozen in a silent scream, and Yakov, his body curled protectively around that of his young son, their faces locked in an eternal embrace of love and despair. The screams, the clawing, the desperate gasps for air, they all came flooding back to Hannah in a torrent of memories that threatened to drown her. She had been there, in the heart of that chamber of horrors, surrounded by the dying throes of her people, her loved ones, as they succumbed to the insidious gas that had stolen their lives. A guttural wail tore from Hannah's throat, a primal cry of anguish and disbelief that echoed through the chamber like the lament of 1,000 souls. She was the sole survivor, a living testament to the unfathomable depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. As the soldier cradled her trembling form, Hannah's eyes swept over the carnage once more, searing the images into her mind with an intensity that would haunt her until her dying breath. These were the faces she would carry with her, the voices that would echo in her nightmares, a constant reminder of the atrocities she had witnessed, and the loved ones she had lost to the insatiable maw of hatred and genocide.